Welcome to KIMEcast, where we break through and cut the BS in sports medicine, rehabilitation, and sports performance, and talk about how things really work. All right, welcome to KIMEcast. I'm Tony Mikla with Russ Dunning. We're with Johnny Owens today. Super excited to have Johnny. He's somebody we've worked with for several years now. I went to one of Johnny's really early presentations on BFR. I think there were 6 of us in the room at that time, which I'm sure you never speak to a group that small anymore.
I'm sorry you had to go to that one, man. That was the early days.
Well, I felt like it was on the cutting edge and still are. Here we are, 5, 6 years later from that time. And this concept of blood flow restriction and BFR is something that I think that you've really brought to the PT community, which is fantastic and something that's really spread. We've seen it spread across, obviously starting probably in professional sports, took off with it really, really quickly. But now we're seeing it infiltrate down into multiple clinic levels. And something that we've used clinically here since we started for the past 5 years, and really found that it's just a tremendous tool. So that the goal of today is to really talk a little bit about that and get your perspective, Johnny, and what you've done. And I want people to know a little bit about your background and history, where you come from, and maybe the history of how you came across this. I think that's a great story, and then how it spread from there. So I'm excited to have you today, man. So it's Johnny, if you guys aren't familiar, so Johnny's PT lives out in San Antonio, Texas, and worked for the military for several years. So I'll let you tell that story a little better than I can, but was the director for the Center of the Intrepid down in San Antonio, Texas, and worked with a ton of military folks during the height of the war in the Gulf and the war in Afghanistan, and learned a lot during that time. So maybe, John, if you could take us through a little bit of kind of what processes and what things and what led you to this would be really cool to hear.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks for having me on, fellas. This is good stuff, man. I started with the Department of Defense in 2004. I got out of PT school in 98, so I'm aging myself here. I'm an old gray hair. Back when they just taught modalities in PT school. And so my kind of emphasis was ortho sports, and I didn't really have fellowships at the time, but I did like an extra sports rotation with one of my mentors, Russ Payne, in Houston. And so that was kind of what I was going to do. The DoD hired me as a contractor, and I was kind of put in place dealing more with the sports side of the house, and the wars were just really kicking off. And so our sports clinic quickly started to become a blast trauma clinic. We were sharing the load there. And so over time, we were getting more and more of the combat casualty, because once the surge hit, we just got crushed. And our facilities at that time were really Vietnam era facilities. San Antonio, our base, Brooke Army Medical Center, is the military's largest medical center in the world. It's the only level 1 trauma center. And so we were pretty robust compared to a lot of the other places, but we weren't prepared for really what hit us. We thought the war was going to be over. When I first interviewed, they said this will probably be a year to an 18-month endeavor. We'll just go and get Bin Laden and be done and be out. And we wrote a paper, what we learned from 14 years of war several years ago. So it rolled into a lot more trauma, and then limb salvage and trauma kind of became more of a passion. And that went into a bunch of different programs, because that was just a big black hole in the physical therapy literature and the orthopedic literature of how to get people back to not just being kind of a person with a limp who's just going to have a desk job. Could I get a tier 1 special forces guy who had a mangled limb back to redeployment and stay on active duty? So we looked at everything from how can we improve bone healing, to how can we regrow lost muscle tissue, to can we build exoskeletons, and then blood flow restriction. Yeah,
I think it's pretty incredible. I know when I first got to meet you, it was interesting. I was at a conference in Arizona, and I was actually listening to Stefania Bell with ESPN. I listened to Stefania present. She was presenting with Dr. Dugas from ASMI down in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about ACL rehabilitation and kind of the future of ACL rehabilitation, and she was talking about what things we can do in rehab, and how to things that are on the cutting edge, things that are coming down the pipeline. And she mentioned BFR at the time. She goes, "There's this new thing that we're playing with, this BFR blood flow restriction concept, and we're seeing some really good results." And she's like, "I really just think this is the future of what's going on." And then Dr. Dugan got up there and talked a little bit about this from the surgical aspect. So it was really good. At my time, I was at Athletes Performance at the time, and I was rehabbing a soccer player who had just undergone an ACL. He'd had I think it was his fifth surgery. There was fourth or fifth surgery. We had the graft, got an infection, had the clean out surgery, the prep for the second, and then got the second ACL. And so I got him about a week post-op. And at that point, he had started doing something I had never heard of, and at this point, I'd never heard of BFR at the time, and he was doing this Katsu strategy of this limb occlusion and doing calisthenics, basically, push-ups, little mini squats, just curls, using his body in these different ways. And so he was doing that, which was interesting. That was kind of in addition to the rehab stuff we were doing, and I've always thought we've had a good ACL program, so we progressed it through. But he was just making ridiculous gains beyond what I had seen before, even working with professional athletes. It's like, this is just incredible, the strides you're making. So I'd had that experience, and then at this conference, Stefania mentioned it, and I'm like, there's this, I've seen this live already, and this is ridiculous, what we're starting to see. And so she mentioned Johnny, and so I was talking to her afterwards, and I'm like, I got to talk to Johnny and see what he's got here and what this is all about, and that's what led us to start to communicate and get to your course and hear about it. So I think it's great, the perspective, obviously, for a huge sacrifice for the military folks that I think we learned from. But what's come out of that is discovering how you could use this idea of occluding blood flow to a limb, and then by actually reducing blood flow, that actually stimulates the hypertrophy process. And I think that's really contradicting what most of us have thought for so many years, right? Is this idea that, you have to really load the limb, and we know to get hypertrophy, you have to be loading at 85-90% of your max, and you have to have these huge loads to get muscle growth. And that's what makes rehab so difficult, is you can't load someone aggressively early on in the process. So this is a tremendous tool where you can use this blood flow restriction. You can load someone at 30%, or something mild as far as the load goes, but occlude blood flow and get a similar hypertrophy result. So I know you're the king of the science behind this, so in the briefest window, maybe you could share how that process works in this game with lactate that we play, and how that unfolds.
Yeah, and so it's always hard to give the elevator pitch on blood flow restriction, especially for me, because then I start geeking out and go really far. And I'll also say, for Stefania Bell, it's like 6 degrees of separation. I think everyone I know who's a friend or someone who's been important in my life has some connection to Stefania, and she reminds me of that like weekly.
Maybe
too.
she should, yeah.
But yeah, so I think we're looking at blood flow restriction kind of in two senses right now. So BFR is basically the application of a tourniquet, and it goes on the proximal upper thigh or the proximal upper arm. And in its most basic sense, we reduce arterial blood flow into a limb to basically choke out the Krebs cycle and take away the oxidative kind of process slow twitch fibers like to use. Your body doesn't really like to engage fast twitch unless it really, really has to. And one of our scientists at our center, he always said muscle physiology is still in a hunter-gatherer kind of evolution. And it's not really valuable to have a lot of muscle, because muscle drives metabolism. Protein synthesis requires ATP. So cavemen weren't looking to add a bunch of muscle unless they had to have it. And if they were running for their life and recruited a ton of fast twitch fibers, evolutionary wise, they would get maybe some more muscle, be bigger, faster, stronger next time. And in rehab, we were never really able to tap into that, that really intense kind of muscle stress that we have to be able to get with low load exercise. And so BFR, by reducing blood flow into that limb, you do this first, typically we do a set of 30 reps, and that uses up the rest of the kind of oxygen supply that's within the muscle. That's still kind of in the slow twitch realm. And then we move into this 3 sets of 15 with 30-second rest periods. And you hope by that point that you're actually moving into having to use fast twitch just because there's not enough oxygen availability. And we've seen that you can do this at loads between 20 to 30% of a 1 rep max seems to be the sweet spot. But even at no load, we've seen that we can hold off atrophy. So that's the easiest kind of explanation. Where we're really moving as well is there's a gene expression component, and that whenever you reduce oxygen levels around a cell, especially for a short period of time, you get these real adaptive changes that can be very powerful. And the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2019 was given to 3 gentlemen for their decades of work of showing reduced oxygen drives gene expression. And so our new studies, and there's some old studies that back this up, but we're really trying to understand how can we apply this for bone and get this gene expression response. We just had a paper come out, can we increase the stem cell content? So when we use orthobiologics, that you can fill that up, and that's a gene expression. Reduce oxygen increases tendon cell proliferation. So that's kind of the more fun and fascinating thing right now.
Yeah, for all the therapists out there, I remember when Tony and I first got together about 6 years ago, and he told me about this concept, and he told me what Johnny Owens had been doing, and we weren't sure if we were ready for the the major expense of your wonderful technology, and we kind of went all in, and it was a big. For us as a very, very small, young company, it was actually our biggest expense early on. We bought a treatment table, brought some massage cream, and then we brought a BFR device from Johnny Owens, Owens Science Recovery, and that was a massive hit. And when we used it for the first time, it was the first time I've seen a young 17-year-old meniscus repair 6 weeks, non-weight bearing. He didn't put that leg down for 6 weeks, and we did BFR on him about 4 or 5 times a week. Through that meniscus repair process. And at the end of 6 weeks, I measured the limb circumference. He had the same size thigh, the same size calf. And when the doctor said, okay, you can do a squat, he did a pain-free squat, full depth, no problem. His gait was perfect right when the limb hit the floor. And my jaw just dropped when I saw that. I said, that's the most insane thing that we could just do a ridiculous amount of leg extensions with the occluded limb, using the BFR strategy and having a fantastic outcome at 6 weeks. And since then, he had a great return back to wrestling. He's now actually in the military as a wrestler, I believe, for the Navy. And it was a great story to see that. Once we saw that, then we had to have a unit at all of our locations, and that's been one of our gold standards. Is every time we open up a location, we need one of these units that helps digitize the occlusion, so we have a really precise occlusion. So maybe you can tell a little bit more about, because there's a lot of stuff out there of just all you got to do is wrap the limb and super tight and you go. There's quite a bit of science on that occlusion parameter. So maybe you can articulate a bit more there.
Yeah, and so luckily at our base, the tourniquet researchers for the DoD, their experts were across the street from us in what's called the Institute of Surgical Research. It's kind of where all of our smart guys and girls live. And so they helped guide us of what's best from a safety perspective, and also if we're going to try and standardize this and make it where it's efficacious for each person, because each person's occlusion pressure is going to be different. They started laying out, if you're going to do this on these wounded warriors, you have to do this properly. And so tourniquets have been around for a very, very long time. And the tourniquet surgical side has spent decades trying to make it as safe as possible. And so tourniquets used to be Class 2 medical devices, which is a moderate FDA classification from a safety profile. The company that the DoD works with and who we work with, their founder in 1980 came up with this modern day microprocess tourniquet, pneumatic tourniquet that everyone uses in the surgical suites. And that reduced the injury rates so much, because one of the biggest injuries that people were getting from tourniquets was nerve damage. And so that reduced the injury rate so much that in 96, the FDA took tourniquet classification down all the way to a Class 1, which that's the same classification as a toothbrush. So the FDA says if you're using a microprocess pneumatic tourniquet, it's the lowest, safest classification that there has. So right off the bat, we said, okay, well, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. This has already been done. This is why the surgeons use this in the OR. Now, when we had also seen, we use battlefield tourniquets. And what we were seeing from the wars is these pump up battlefield tourniquets that put on a lot of occlusion, and they're austere environments. So they have to carry around some of these pump up things that you're seeing a lot of people use. This really large paper that looked back at all the years of war, there was a significant amount of nerve damage that people had from those. And so the saying with those type of tourniquets is they'll save a life, not a limb. But you can't bury your head in the clinic and say, well, I'm just going to use this thing because it's cheaper or whatever. because you're not in an austere environment, and so you can cause some significant risk, and it'd be really hard in a court of law, I think, to defend why you chose to use this when the entire medical community says and the FDA says this is the safest way to do it. So that was really our decision, that we had to follow the rules and the decades of research and make it safe. And then we also knew we needed to reduce the arterial flow the same in each individual. And if I did 200 on Tony, who's got real little legs, that's going to probably include him a lot, but your legs, 200 might only be 50% occlusion. So the more muscle you have versus adiposity, your blood pressure, the width of the tourniquet, all these things play into it. So your young, high school person is going to need a different occlusion than an NFL quarterback or an elderly person. So we had these Doppler-like technology that they were able to build into the tourniquets that would measure that on each individual, and then we could standardize it. And we really put a call out like early on, because when we were looking at that first literature, like some of that Katsu stuff, we reviewed that because really that was the only thing out there besides some physiological lab things. It's very thin. We did a study and we took it all the way up to 500 and we still weren't able to occlude the artery. So we weren't really getting full occlusion to know how much we would dial that back. So it was too thin and too narrow. These pump-uppy things, you pump them up and then they just drift, they go back down and they lose their pressure. And so, we started to really try and push that we need to personalize this. We started putting out papers, personalizing it. A few other groups did. And a paper just came out and it showed, in like 2010, 2011, when we were first starting, the majority of the papers were just saying, everyone gets 200 millimeters of mercury. And now if you look at 2018, which is where this study ended, almost all the papers are personalized. They're using limb occlusion pressure, the technology that we've really been pushing forward. So by doing what you guys are doing too, you're not only following the safest practice, but you're kind of following the science of this is direction, all the research. And it's hard to get a paper through review anymore if you're not using some sort of Doppler or personalized pressure.
So for the less nerdy people out there, part of what Johnny was saying, the microprocessor part, is if we set this occlusion pressures at, say, 160 millimeters of mercury, it maintains that 160 throughout the exercise. So if you're 15 minutes on a stationary bike and you're doing that 15-minute aerobic protocol, you can assume that the leg might swell a little bit. Right. We're gonna get some fluid, that's cellular kind of popping, and you'll see it. The limb will get a little more red, it'll get a little bit thick, and the tourniquet will adjust that pressure. If it didn't adjust it, then naturally, if it held on to the same circumference, then that pressure would actually increase as you keep working out. But the microprocessor allows it to maintain the same pressure as the leg swells a bit.
Exactly, and also when you're moving, the limb is changing shapes as well. In the surgical suites, it's not as big of a deal, even though you still have to use a microprocess system. But that movement is caught up, and you'll notice the system, the numbers are changing to try and keep the same limb occlusion pressure based on the changes in the size of the limb. And so I was going to say something else on that. Oh, well, I'm blanking there. Oh, there was a study done, Dr. Hughes over in London. So they used kind of Delphi because it was the gold standard. They put these little sensors under the cuff and they measured what the machine said the pressure was to what the sensors said it was. And it was exactly the same as you would expect with that system. Then they used this little pump up one. I think it's called occlusion cuff, the one they used. And they did the same thing. They pumped it up to a pressure and then they put the sensors under the cuff. What the cuff was measuring out was completely different than what the little dial was showing. So even if you documented, okay, I did 200 millimeters of mercury on this person, there's a published paper saying what they measured on the cuff, it's not regulated. You don't even know what that pressure was. It could have been lower, it could have been significantly higher, which again, isn't good for efficacy or safety.
Yeah, I think it's been cool. I think from a clinical standpoint, what's great is it's simple, and I think, like Russ said, there's such a great progression in orthopedic surgery to do these, scopes and meniscus repairs and different types of cartilage repairs and tissue work, and then maybe put someone in a non-weight bearing state or protected state for 4 to 6 weeks to allow tissue to heal, and then oftentimes they're just kind of, we hear it all the time, like the doc says, don't do PT for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, just wait for it to kind of heal and sit. And then I think what happens is we see that the tissue healing phase might be 12 to 14, 16 weeks probably, so maybe 3 to 4 months. But the rehab process ends up being 6 to 9 months because we're trying to battle this atrophy that came on to the process because of so much downtime. What we've seen with this has been that if we can apply it early during that time frame when the tissue is healing, we can work someone with, like you said, with no load or 20% of their max, which is very, very mild, just to have them move a little bit. And this idea of occlusion is going to help them at least reduce atrophy, if not even give us a little bit of hypertrophy during that time period. So when, like Russ's experience, when we took the training wheels off and allowed them to walk again, they're ready to go, and there's a lot more. The tissue's ready to go. The tissue's already had some adaptation, and you're not starting from a negative position. And I think that's something that we strive for, and we see a tremendous impact on our common stuff, our ACLs, meniscus repairs. We use it on some of even our total knees. It's usually the folks that are probably on a little younger side and are tolerant to it, because like Johnny will tell you, this is not the most comfortable treatment you've ever had in your life. It's a pretty strong constriction. It's going to grab you and it's going to squeeze pretty hard. But if we're looking at from an evidence-based standpoint, evidence-based practice and such, there's probably nothing out there that has more evidence than this that we actually do clinically. It fits right in there with exercise, eating well, and this is a form of exercise that actually just amplifies the benefits of exercise in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think, and getting back to your point about we're able to use this in those early phases of rehab, that's where BFR really shines. And one of the problems, I didn't have to deal with this in the military, but you guys deal with it. People burn their PT insurance visits up in those early phases, and then you're just watching the muscle waste away. Typically. Low load exercise doesn't drive muscle protein synthesis. It doesn't hold off catabolism. So they're atrophying, and you're working on range and all this other. And then it's like, okay, now we need the muscle to be there. And the doc's like, okay, cool. It's 12 weeks. You're ready to run. And it's like, man, I need like 4 more months to restore what happened from this anabolic resistance. So to be able to maintain that. And then once they get off that protective phase, be like, cool, now we're ready to go. If you're doing it right, I think it's been such a win. And then this has this double kind of thing going for it right now. There's a lot of evidence for it. I mean, if you Google Scholar blood flow restriction, you get papers almost daily now, but there's a science-based side to it as well, because evidence is hard. I do lots of research, and it's a pain in the ass. And some studies, even some I've been involved with, they're like, I'm not so sure about. I'm a little embarrassed that one's out there. But when you can go back and say, man, look at all these like high-powered physiological labs around the world who are saying it drives mTORC1, it drives satellite cell content, it does all these physiological things, and they're just looking at it from mechanisms. That's huge for our profession, because then we can say, look, the science is just here. These guys aren't even therapists. They're just the ones who are trying to prove this science. And by the way, now here's the clinical trials that show if you apply it, you get here. That can be very powerful, I think, for us.
Yeah, I think it's something we got to take advantage of as a profession for sure. You made the point before when we've talked that, a good physical therapy study might have 20 to 30 people in it, and we consider that to be like a strong study in our field, which is kind of sad. In the physiology world, if you took that to a physiology group and said, hey, we had 30 people in the study, this is what we found, they'd be like, okay, well, is that just like the case example, or when do we start the study? Like, I want thousands of people in the study, and that's what you're seeing with a lot of this research is we're talking about large groups, like large applicable changes across the population.
Yeah, and large funding, which has been powerful, and a lot of that's been driven because the orthopedic surgeons have really embraced this in a big way. I had a talk last week with an orthopedic group, and they were kind of laughing, like, this is one of the first times orthopedic surgeons have been like kind of giddy about something in rehab, and so the majority of our trials are all orthopedic surgeon based, and they have a bigger share of the pot of money lots of times. And then what's really good with this, especially now that we're getting people to standardize it and we're able to say, okay, we're all kind of using this the same way. We know how much percentage of limb occlusion pressure you did. We kind of follow the same volume schemes. We have so many different trials going on that we're getting lots of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So maybe it is an ACL trial that we're doing at Rush and we only enrolled 60, but we got one down at Methodist that's about to come out. They enrolled, I think, 40 something. We got Memorial Herman's that's coming out. Stanford's one's coming out. And so if you get all of these trials and everyone's kind of using the same approach, just systematic review and meta-analysis, and that's basically the highest tier evidence that we can get. And so that's going to be huge. And then I'm pretty excited that we're seeing that.
Well said.
That's huge.
Yeah, I think when it comes to BFR, for both the clinicians and the just regular patients or regular people out there, well, we use 3 of Johnny's protocols. So we'll do a protocol that's the ischemic preconditioning protocol. Correct? Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
The
Yep.
IPC. And that we use when really someone can't even move their limb, they're in a really difficult state, and they're not really able to even really do any kind of dynamic exercise or muscle contractions. So we just put the tourniquet on for about 25 minutes, and it cycles in and out of a pressurized state and then in a non-pressurized state to help get this gene expression going. And then we use more of a strength-based protocol. So that would be the 30, 15, 15, 15 that you see out there on the research a lot. And that's, again, going back to like a 30% 1 RM. So we'll do some arm curls. We'll do some leg extensions. We might put them on a leg press. And then we'll use an aerobic protocol, the 15-minute protocol, and we put them on a stationary bike, and we have them cycle for 15 minutes. And I've been really amazed at how well our clinicians in-house have used all 3 depending on the scenario. And if they're in a higher level state, if they're 5 weeks out, 8 weeks out, then we bounce back and forth between the strength and the aerobic protocol really almost every day if we can. Have them come to the gym and set them up, and have an aide or a coach set them up. And it's really, like, from a clinician standpoint, it's great because I know that they're doing something physiologically awesome. And I don't have to be right there with them, so that they get that dose very often without it, like you said, eating up a visit. Like, hey, let's get a physiology dose. So you're going to get that, and then we'll get your manual therapy, your progression of exercise during your session. So we've utilized that really extensively, and I think an awesome level thanks to all your research and what you've done with it.
Yeah, and you're really following, tip of the spear there. So it's evidenced, and we can talk about the papers, but we work with every professional team pretty much in America, and the Delphi system you guys use, the one that we use, it's on workers' comp with every professional team in the country. So pretty much any limb injury you see of a pro athlete, they're going to get a system sent to their team for them to use. And it's that exact same approach. Early on, this IPC setting, move into the load, and then move into this endurance protocol with load. So you're really kind of following, what the top guys are doing, and you guys are the top guys as well. So I wouldn't expect anything less. And the IPC stuff's interesting because it's moving outside of just using it to hold off atrophy in the early phases when you're in disuse, but even is it something we can do for recovery, even something that we can do for maybe enhancing performance. So now we're kind of toying around. I just did a talk with the MLB guys last night, and that was probably the number one thing they all want to hear about was that for recovery and performance.
Yeah, I think that I was going to ask this earlier, Johnny. I think that even brings it up more is that we see certainly one thing that the orthos are excited about and sports med docs are excited about is this idea of injecting stem cells, PRP, these types of things to get these physiological changes in the body. And basically those are tools to use to stimulate the body to change, much in the same way that exercise is, but oftentimes we can't exercise those people because they're too painful to load the tissue properly, right? So we've used this tremendously with the patellotendinitis folks and some of the hamstring tendonitis folks, and some of the Achilles folks have been amazing as well, especially for the lower extremity. We haven't done as much on the upper as far as like elbow epicondylitis, but for the lower extremity, we've used it a ton and found tremendous impact on using it in that regard. And some of the chemical effects of BFR are that we see this increase in HGH in the system, we see this increased levels of testosterone in the system, and those are your growth tools to grow tissue and to heal tissue. So it just makes a ton of sense to do it, and it's so natural. And whether or not those become performance enhancing, I guess, would be the ultimate debate. But
yeah, we'll see. Well, and that's eccentrics. They work for a hamstring, and heavy load works for Achilles. And BFR is more and more, it's analogous to a surrogate of that heavy load. So a lot of the things we see as the downstream effects of that load, other than the actual load itself, which is important. Everyone's like, right, you just do BFR and low load. No, and right. I'm like, no. For sure, load, and myself, I hate it. It's too hard. I'm a wuss, so I just like to go lift weights. But when people are like, well, how's it doing that? It's like, well, everything we see with heavy load we're pretty much seeing happens with blood flow restriction. And the reason why those things work with heavy load is because those are all powerful things. The problem is, again, you can't do that post-surgery, post-injury. BFR is just a perfect replacement for that. And for a while, it was always, well, BFR, with all systematic reviews of analysis show low load or with free flow, no blood flow restriction, or low load with BFR beats it. I mean, that's just like not even debatable now. But then it was always, well, heavy load always beats BFR. And we pretty much said, yeah, we believe this. But a systematic review and meta-analysis just came out from a really high-powered physiological lab over in Europe, Per Argaard's group, and they teased out really the well-done papers that measured strength the right way and kind of followed the rules of how to do things right. And they really found in their systematic review and meta-analysis, BFR and lifting heavy were basically very similar from a strength standpoint. There was no statistical difference. They both improved strength, and it was very similar. So I think as time goes on, we're going to be learning more and more. And from a tendon standpoint, then you're getting decreased load so the patient can tolerate it, but you're also probably getting tendon adaptations through this gene expression that we're trying to understand more. And you're also getting a strength and hypertrophy response for the muscle early on. So it's a nice segue.
Yeah, we've seen great stuff just on patellofemoral pain, patellotendonitis especially, Achilles tendonitis. We've used it extensively on that non-op population, and it's been great as well. Even in combination, if someone gets PRP or a stem cell injection of some kind, using it in combination with it's been a fantastic way to progress.
You know, years ago, I think your first course that you had for us several years ago, you mentioned something about even using it for low back pain. And I work a lot with our UFC champion, ex-champion, soon-to-be again champion in the next year or two, Cody Garbrandt. And he had debilitating back pain. And, he went to Germany, had all the fancy, stuff there. And he went through all around the United States trying to find doctors to help him out with his back. And really at the point of his lowest point, kind of just gave up. Came, had to kind of come back to me. We tried a little bit, and he came back. And we did BFR on him for a low back, discogenic, sciatic, degeneration, all the whole mess of low back. And I just BFR that leg, and we did probably, maybe 10,000 lunges that year with BFR. And he hasn't had a problem with his back ever since. And yeah, we did our back therapy. We worked on back strengthening, core strengthening, hip mobility. But I really believe that the BFR with doing lunges, I picked a lunge because it was more of a back safe exercise versus a squat or a leg press or even a leg extension. I wanted his hips in a split stance. But for people who think that the BFR is really only for either post-operative, post-trauma, or kind of like this lower extremity stuff, we used it for a high-level mover for a really horrible back injury, and to do everything that you just said, gene expression, improving some hormonal stuff in his body, and doing it the natural way, and have him get a feel of aggressive work on his body without the load. And that was the secret sauce to his development.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the key there is, it can be a replacement for load with someone who is load intolerant. And maybe he can get to the point where he's load intolerant. And there's been some really high profile guys in the NFL who've had some back issues that just went and then did the same thing. Like, I'm moving to blood flow restriction and able to maintain it at that level from everything we're getting from BFR at the musculoskeletal side without having to go in and start loading and cranky kind of back. And the same thing, they progress. We don't know if BFR did anything for the back, but I think just being able to deload but maintain a high level of fitness is what it took.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I just really appreciate all you've done, Johnny, to take all this research. Every time I talk to you, it's like, oh my gosh, like there's just so much information. So I appreciate you always consolidating it down and speaking in such simple terms that you use to us.
I'm a local yokel from West Texas. English is barely my first language. I speak Texan.
No, very much. But you guys are listening. You'll see. Well, you may not see more of Johnny. He always tries to be like off camera. It seems to me. I see him very little, but he's actually in the media extensively with BFR, and certainly we see. If you guys are following the Alex Smith story, Johnny was a huge part of Alex's process from quite a while back to where he's at now, and he speaks of it in the. On Stefania Bell did a special on Alex, and he spoke of it this last Sunday on an E60 profile, and I know that you're doing some other stuff with some other networks on telling his story. So hopefully you guys can see him out there. Or if not, you'll see the science of what's going on if Johnny still slips off camera somehow.
Yeah. No, very, very good story. It's kind of the story we need right now. And from a blood flow restriction standpoint, we started on Alex almost immediately when I got out of the hospital. You know, he was still in the frame. You know, we met at Alex's house with his medical team. His plastic surgeon was there. You know, it's interesting. Ischemic preconditioning is basically kind of following the Nobel Prize guy stuff and some work that was done decades ago on dogs. And if you put a limb into hypoxia, or you put that hypoxia around the cells, there's a protective effect. There's even some fascinating studies. You know, there's this one study where on Olympic level swimmers, they did ischemic preconditioning prior to their swim and then improved their swim times by 0.7 seconds. And then they drew blood pre doing that or post doing that. And then they put it into a pig who they basically clamped off the artery to cause the heart to start to have damage. If they injected blood that was in the post condition people, so they'd had that application of hypoxia, it actually significantly protected the heart from damage. So there's this kind of blood response there. And his plastic surgeon, so Alex had multiple muscle flaps. That's where you take muscle from other parts of your body because he lost so much muscle down on his lower leg. And I was talking to his plastic surgeon. He's like, oh yeah, when I take that muscle flap away, I close the artery off and we count for several minutes and then release it. So he was doing ischemic preconditioning on the muscle on the table just by cutting off blood supply for a little bit before he harvested it and put it down there. So he's like, yeah, go for it. You know, you can start it right away. Because I wasn't worried about the ortho guys being nervous with it. It was the plastic surgeon was he worried about the flaps. And so he let us start it right away. To your point earlier, Tony, you know, he was in that frame for months and he did BFR. I mean, he was religious, like daily. And when the frame came off, we tested him back at our center. And basically from his thigh perspective, there was really no deficits that we could pick up, even in our biomechanics lab. You know, he just maintained that strength while keeping that frame on the entire time.
That's amazing.
Really fascinating.
Yeah, that's just, it sounds like magic.
Yeah, it's insanity.
I
mean, it's truly a breakthrough. So it's incredible. Obviously, incredible story. But I know that we all have several of them that are similar but less high profile. But just it's really incredible to see. So I appreciate bringing it to the forefront. I think there's something else that I saw with you years ago as we got a chance to talk more about something else that you guys have done, and I think in the military that I think is just maybe the tip of the iceberg in the rehab or in the performance training community. We played with some stuff at Exos on the mental side and mental preparation and predicting environments and these types of things. But I know you guys had an amazing virtual reality lab that you utilized, and I think that this brings up always this idea for me as far as when athletes are ready to return to sport or people are ready to return to activity and how we push them. And we know this concept of sensory integration is huge. So obviously with BFR is great in the initial stages to build up muscle tissue and make sure that the musculoskeletal system is there. But then when we go to return to sport, we've got to be able to have this firing, these synapses firing, have it be sharp and have them have this systemic integration of sensory from smell to taste to predicting pain or feeling pain or nervousness of going back onto a field where they've been hurt before and those types of things. So I'm super interested in this concept of virtual reality and how helping a client or an athlete experience the environment that they might actually participate or play in prior to getting to it. I know with you working with the special ops guys, that's obviously critically important. When we're working with a football guy, if we put a guy back on the field and he's not quite ready to go, he might do a play or two and be like, yeah, you know what, it's not good, I'm out. But when you're working with a special ops team and you send a SEAL team out and there's 8 guys on the squad and if one of them can't go, the whole team's at serious life-threatening risk. Right. So that return to sport for that group's a different animal. So I know you guys used it a little bit in that environment, I think.
Yeah, we did, you know, because like you said, it's life or death. So we call it RTD, so it's a return to duty package. And it's, you know, I'm actually writing I'm in charge of a book chapter, an orthopedic book on return to play with some other folks right now. So we're trying to whittle it out. And I think you guys understand it as well. We really don't know the best criteria for return to play. And then a lot of times it's like, cool, they passed their jump test, now get on back out there. And how could that ever recreate what this person's going to have to do either on the battlefield or on the soccer field? So yeah, we had amazing tools at our center. We had a couple of virtual reality things that were valuable, and one was a shooting lab. And so this was just a large room with basically a virtual kind of world on the walls. And so you had different things like a boulder they had to get down under versus, a door with a glass that was busted out. Could they get behind that and get up and get down? And one of our special forces former patients ran the lab. And that was more watching and just putting them in that sensory environment. And he's doing timing and videotaping and showing us, hey, this guy, he got down and it took him a second and a half to get up off the ground. Well, that could be life or death. So then he took that back to therapy and would say, even though we might have tested that, when he's got a gun and another guy shooting at him, he's given us like, he needs to work on this. And then so we would take him out in environments and try and really stimulate him and see if we could better that. Then our other part was called the Karen system, CAREN. And so when the wars started, we didn't have the Center for the Intrepid. We ramped it up really quickly, and it's an amazing story. The center was built off of donations from the American public and what was called the Intrepid Fallen Heroes Fund, the Mr. Fisher. Not a single tax dollar went to that, and it's just amazing place. It's the Disney World of rehab. But we were still trying to understand war, and we sent a contingent over to Israel because they're always in war. And so they, to see kind of what they were doing to maintain force readiness, and they were using these Karen systems and telling us, it was valuable. And so the Karen is this giant dome. So it looks like Epcot or something at Disney World when you go in, and you go into it, and there's a treadmill that's on a platform, and you get on the treadmill, and it kind of floats out into the middle. It's on a little steel pole, and it floats you out into the middle of that dome. And then you can recreate whatever world you want. If you want Syria, our programmers can build Syria, and we have all this. I can't really go there, but there's ways they can recreate these worlds. And the treadmill not only moves, but if you're running up a hill, it'll go up the hill. If an IED goes off, it shakes and tries to recreate the shaking of the IED. You can have your comrades on the side. They even have it set up now where we have virtual and other bases where they can be there with their buddies, and they're wearing their goggles and seeing that their buddies are there while they're rehabbing in that system. I mean, at its highest level, if we're really trying to stimulate, we could put out the smell of burning flesh, and having that, the over sensory type of things. That one, it's a full biomechanical system. So it's not okay, this is what I'm seeing, although we watch them to see it, but we get, force plate data, we get biomechanics data, and they would come back with this just list. The problem early on was just information overload. We're just like, holy shit. Okay, yeah, I'm not really sure what I can do about this or whatever. So we had to really, and I think anyone that moves into this space, try and figure out if you're getting that laser type of data, what really is important. But, there were some fascinating things at times. I remember one story of one of our SF guys. He was, if you see the guys moving through a street and they're in a group, you notice how they're all kind of pointing in a certain direction. They have to cover their quadrant. So you don't want your guy on your left, if he hears a noise, to spin around and try and shoot that way, because he's going to shoot you in the head. You got to trust your buddy next to you is covering that backside for you. And so this one guy kept missing some targets on his right. He was just like a post-op ACL. He didn't even really recognize he did it, but it wasn't really meeting this threshold when he was doing it when he was on his left side. And it was basically, he just was having a trouble with that internal rotation on his right leg. And so, the biomechanics data tease it out. He's not rotating just enough. So he might have missed that guy at his 90-degree angle. And it was basically go back to rehab, work on getting that internal rotation back. Let's recheck you. Once we check you off, you're return to duty, game ready. Now we're okay sending you back to your unit and saying you got the CFI blessing. So from that kind of standpoint, I would have never picked that up. That's huge. And maybe it's life-saving. And that's the recreation that I think this technology is hopefully going to be able to get us to, even with, if my young daughter has an ACL from soccer, that she could do some sort of VR test to get game ready.
Next level. That's amazing.
Yeah, I really think there's a lot to that. I mean, obviously that proves it, but there's so much, as we all know. I always tell our therapists, to go and do something in the clinic versus what really gains speed is such a big difference between those two things. And if you ever watch someone on virtual reality, they put the goggles on and, they're moving all around, they're reacting to the visual stimulus, right? So their body has these reactions, and those reactions are really what we're after. And often in the clinic, you're not going to get those natural reactions. You're going to get a very, predictable kind of, it's a safe environment, I'm doing it this way. And even if you're doing some reactive agility, it's still mild in comparison to what's really coming on when there's a ball flying at you. I mean, just think about football, for example. You're working with a wide receiver, ACL. Let's run, let's jump, let's cut. Okay, now let's throw a ball. It's a little bit behind you. You got to reach outside your base support over here, and you're going to get hit from the far side. This way, you're going to get hit from this side. Now your body's position's never been in since the injury, and you might just curl up in a ball and fall, and maybe you save your ACL, but you're probably getting cut from the team because you're ineffective, So did we really return you back to sport, or did we just get you good enough to try to play? And I think that's a really reasonable, for me, that's a big passion, is how do we get people really back to a level?
It's a double-edged sword. A controlled clinical environment is never going to recreate that environment. And then we are in a liability kind of issue.
Yeah,
you guys are.
right.
I wasn't.
Yeah.
But your goal is not like, let me do something that can hurt you to see if you pass that test. Because if they get hurt, you're like, well, shit, okay, now.
Yeah,
now I'm in trouble.
there we go. Didn't work.
At our place, our orthopedic trauma director, he said, if you break them, I'll fix them. So we were, our goal was to put them to the limit because they wanted to redeploy. I think I would be really nervous, and so I think with AI, we would have to look at, is there a different consent almost, like, okay, this is game ready, and you're going to be put under some stressors that you might not be ready for, but you're going to be out in a field where they want to hurt you. So we got to test this somehow.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I'm sure we'll see more and more down the path of that technology, because it's not that expensive. A couple $100 for a Oculus unit or whatever it is now. And then a little bit of programming around it. I could see that being the next phase that we'll see more and more of. So I think you're absolutely right.
The technology's moving fast, so I think we're going to have to be ready and be caught up, and we're going to have to dictate what we want from it is going to be the key.
Exactly. When and how much can we use it? Yeah. So super cool. Well, Johnny, it's been great talking with you, man, again, and I appreciate you. Appreciate the knowledge as always and the insight on the BFR stuff. For you guys listening that aren't familiar with Johnny, he does have his own podcast that they run. Owens Recovery Science is his site and his podcast info. Just a tremendous amount of knowledge on his stuff. His presentations for continuing education or become certified in BFR sounds a lot like what you heard here. Obviously much more in depth, but lots of research, unbelievable amounts of studies and diving through it. And then really looking at the data and kind of making it clinically relevant for all of us. So I know I've gotten a ton out of those courses. I really appreciate it. And I think that if you have a chance to get a chance to listen in or see the courses or get the certification, I think it's well worth it. For sure. I know it's benefited us tremendously.
For sure. Absolutely.
So kind of a game changer, if nothing else, on just the physiology of actually how muscle tissue changes and adapts and those types of things are things we all need to know and be refreshed on. And the only course I know of that does it is yours, so I really appreciate that.
Yep. Huge respect.
Thanks, man. Thanks, you guys. It's good seeing you again. Stay safe.
Yeah.
All right. You too, buddy. Take care, Johnny.
All right, man.
Thanks, Johnny.
Y'all take care. Later.
You guys are watching KIMEcast. Thank you. This was KIMEcast, and we are the KIME Human Performance Institute. Thank you very much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. Please hop on our social media. It's at KIMEHPI and engage with us there. If you'd like us to feature a topic or answer any questions live on the show, post your comments there. You can also check us out on our website at kimeperformance.com, and there you can see links to content that we've posted throughout our podcast for more information.